Hi,
Hi.
Eugene Roth. Explain life before, during, and after the flood, please.
And when you talk about the flood, you're talking about the
Flood
June
Agnes.
23rd, 1972 flood that they called the Agnes.
Yes.
Um, well, prior to the flood, um, um, in terms of the broader general community, the population was about 60,000. Um, there were approximately 6,000 Jews in the Wyoming Valley. Um, the makeup of the Jewish community in the floodplain, what it's called the floodplain, between the two mountains and in what we call the Wyoming Valley, which is Wilkes-Barre is part of the Wyoming Valley. Um, we had we had uh, three synagogues in Wilkes-Barre. Um, there was a conservative temple, the Orthodox temple, which is Congregational Zedek, which is our and is still our congregation. We had probably at the time, I would say 450 families to 500 families in the congregation. Um, Originally, it was called Congregation Ungarian of Zedek, and only Hungarians were permitted to become members, but that changed. That changed when I was, even before I was born. And I was born in 1935. And by the way, the first major flood that occurred in the Wyoming Valley was in 1935, 1936, 1936. But in any event, we had the United Hebrew Institute, which is a Hebrew Orthodox Hebrew day school, Torah Masorah. All of my children graduated from the United Hebrew Institute, also called the Israel Ben Zion Academy. Probably had at the time about 150, 160 children. Went from pre-kindergarten through the 8th grade. Jewish Community Center with a very large membership. Wyoming Valley Jewish Committee, which was a federation at the time. During the course of the campaign, we would raise from our small community.
The campaign, you mean the campaign for recovery?
No, no, no.
Oh, no.
I'm just giving you the broad picture before the flood. But in any event, at that time, we raised somewhere in the neighborhood of $1,250,000, which is a lot of money at that time. The Jewish community was made up of doctors, lawyers, but in large measure merchants who had businesses throughout the community. And we were a happy, content, prosperous, active Jewish community.
Well, the camera's still on.
And things were wonderful. Then Friday, June 23rd, 1972, after a period of almost a week of constant rain, the river kept rising and rising and rising, and maybe when we get finished, I'll take you over and I'll show you what happened. The water was rising and rising and rising, and at approximately, I would say 6, 7 o'clock Friday morning, we suddenly got sirens. Everybody was listening to the radio because we knew that flooding could happen. And suddenly we received instructions that everybody in Wyoming Valley had to immediately leave their homes, evacuate their homes. So you had no opportunity to do anything. We couldn't move anything. The order was, get out now.
So you heard of the storm before?
Well, we experienced all the rain, and we knew that the river was rising. And as a matter of fact, when I received a telephone call from one of my partners, and he said, I'm leaving my house, we're evacuating, and he said, you're going to be getting orders to evacuate momentarily. Well, my mother was living here. This was her home.
Uh-huh.
So, and I lived about 1.5 miles further downriver. And first thing I did was I jumped in my car and I drove over to see my mother and to tell her that she better come with me and leave the house.
Right.
And my mother, who was a stubborn Hungarian, said, no, 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 I don't have to leave yet. No, no, everything's going to be fine. I've been listening to the radio, and everything's going to be fine. And so I went back home.
So people in the area didn't think that it was actually going to flood?
No, not until we got the final sirens that were thundering throughout the entire community and the direction. And the police cars were moving throughout the area telling people to immediately evacuate and so forth. So I went home and got everybody in the car, and everybody was 4 children, little children. I don't even remember in 1972, I don't know how old Joan would have been, but in any event, Connie, me, and we had a little dog. All right. So we evacuated, and I drove up to my mother's house, and I said, now you have to come with me.
Right.
Just come with me. And so she did. Now the question was, where were we going to go?
Right.
And there is a hotel now still in existence called the Woodlands. It was owned by the Kornfeld family, who prior to the flood had a kosher restaurant in downtown Wilkes-Barre called the S&B Restaurant. And so in any event, that was the beginning of what turned out to be a multi-year major problem. The net effect was that there were 25,000 people who were evacuated from Wilkes-Barre and were scattered everywhere. On the west, some people went on to stay with friends on the west side across the river. The problem ultimately, after the flood, it took down one of the bridges. The river, the force of the river took down one bridge and damaged the main bridge. And there was about a period of about a week where we couldn't even get back into town to see what happened. And when I returned, the family was still living. All the people I just described, including my mother, lived in one motel room.
Oh, wow.
Right, for a week. And I think I described to you the fact that Shabbos, my nephew was to be bar mitzvahed.
Right.
And for reasons that I cannot explain, the only thing that my wife took was an ark and my bar mitzvah And if you can wait a minute, I'll get it,
Sure.
and we'll show it to you.
Okay. Just go and get stuff for you to see. Yes.
So, but when he turned, look at either this one or that one. That's pictures, fine. Where? He's gone. Where's the rest? Where's the art? Just tell me, I can go find it. No, you won't. Excuse me. No, you can tell that just so you can tell that.
So here is the ark, and maybe you can find the sitter. Here is the ark, and my mother and father brought this back from Israel.
Uh-huh.
So here is the ark, and inside
That's amazing. That's tiny.
is the Torah, and you see there's the dressing and so forth.
Wow.
And this was used. This is the only Torah. I mean, this was used for his bar mitzvah, and obviously we still have this.
Wow.
Now, the net effect was that there were, as things settled, the destruction was so extensive that this was, this is my bar mitzvah sitter.
Wow.
This is the sitter, and it's not in very good shape, but in any event, this is what he used to daven for.
Wow.
After the flood, my involvement became fairly extensive because I had just been elected the president of the Jewish Community Center,
Mm-hmm.
and so at that point we had a tremendous amount of damage to the Jewish Community Center. The whole first floor was entirely destroyed. The United Hebrew Institute, which was a one-story school building,
Mm-hmm.
that was completely destroyed. The synagogues, we were fortunate. The damage that we had was all in the basement, but in the basement that's where we daven on a daily basis. So that was destroyed. Big auditorium with a stage it's where we had functions in the shul and so forth. The conservative temple had similar damage, and the totality was enormous. So much so that if we took all of the cost of repair, we'd be talking in the millions and millions of dollars.
Wow.
Now, so what happened? At the same time, let me just skip forward because I'll give you the government involvement. I was on a committee with three bankers and Judge Max Rosen, who had been my partner before he became a judge. And that committee met with representatives of the House of Representatives, with our own congressmen, with our senators and so forth.
And
And we put together a plan of recovery.
uh-huh.
And that plan of recovery uh, entailed um, a grant to a homeowner of $5,000
Mhm.
and a loan that could be up to 30 years at 1% interest. So it was
Very
really,
nice.
really unheard. Now that took a long time to get through, because there were other communities in the country that had similar
Right.
disasters, and they never had this kind of a program. We created that program.
Right.
Um,
This was a special program just for Flood Agnes.
just for Flood Agnes, but interestingly enough, Congress being Congress, they started to bring in other communities. For example, they had had a disaster the previous year in Alaska, so the Congress people and the senators in Alaska, they got wrapped into the program, and there were one or two others. But that enabled us to at least be able to put our homes together.
Right.
Now here's the reality. My mother lived in this house. She was a widow.
Mhm.
She had wanted to sell the house. I encouraged her because the market was at the time was terrible for real estate not to sell the house. My house was essentially destroyed, so I bought her house.
Wow.
I bought her house, and I was able to use the money I got from, and it was all focused through the Small Business Administration, the SBA.
Mhm.
So the loan that I took out a $50,000 loan, and I gave her the $50,000 to
Mhm.
buy the house. And then I was able to sell my house, what was left of my house,
Right.
for $25,000. And with that $25,000, we were able to repair this home. Fortunately, this home is a brick home, solid brick.
Mhm.
And even though we had on top of the roof 17 feet above the
Wow.
roof
That's a lot.
was the height of the and I've given you some of the pictures. I don't know if you'll be able
Yeah.
to share them with the class, but it'll show you how high that water was. Now, in the Jewish community, there were a lot of older Jewish people who just said, I'm not going to repair my house, I'm moving. And they went to Florida, they went to New York, they went with their children, wherever they went. And there were a lot of Jewish businessmen who said, I'm not going to go back into my business, it was too difficult. And for those people who stayed here, the question was, well, we had to help the business people. We had to do any number of things to reconstruct, if you will, the community. Didn't know where we were going to get the money for the repairs and so forth. Fortunately, or unfortunate as the case may be, Wilkes University, which is, you drove by Wilkes University, that was flooded. Um, there were several high schools, private high schools, that were also flooded. And of course the school was flooded. And believe it or not, even though they were a religious institution and a private institution, the university was a private university, the federal government gave each institution a grant sufficient to rebuild their properties.
Wow.
So we did not have to go out and take a loan for the UHI. And that was all paid for by the federal government. I don't think that could happen again, but that was then. And now at the same time, we were looking at how's the Jewish community going to survive? How are they going to fund themselves? And that was the question. And that's when we contacted the Council of Jewish Federations.
Mm-hmm.
And the Council of Jewish Federation is the parent group of all of the federations throughout the United States. We started to receive contacts from a number of different Jewish organizations. B'nai B'rith contacted us. We were contacted by the Jewish Welfare Board. The Jewish Welfare Board provides direction, parental, if you will. They're the parent organization of the Jewish community centers, and so forth. They all convened and they agreed that they would vest in the Council of Jewish Federations the authority to act for all of the organizations to create a fund of dollars that would provide for the well-being of the Jewish community. Now, the Jewish Community Center had a mortgage,
Mm-hmm.
the shul had a mortgage, Federation had a mortgage. How are we going to pay the mortgage? How are we going to fund all of these agencies? Well, as a result of the Council of Jewish Federations, nationwide, countrywide, they raised nearly $3 million
Wow.
to provide enough money so that we would have enough money to pay the mortgages,
Mm-hmm.
so that we would all be debt-free.
Mm-hmm.
They sent to the community professional social workers to meet with the people, because they were all traumatized. And what am I going to do? How am I going to live? What am I going to do? They set up food banks. I mean, they did everything necessary for well over a year.
Wow.
To meet and deal with all of the many families here. And then we set up in our own group
Mm-hmm.
a business council where people could come and get short-term loans. So we took money from that $3+ million and we made loans to Jewish businessmen to help them get back into business.
Did the federal government help you in any of this?
They did. They provided loans, structural loans. They did provide also business loans, but there was a period of time. I mean, you can imagine there were thousands and thousands of people who inundated the SBA, and until that money began to flow, we had to help get the Jewish merchants back into business.
Right.
So those were the short-term loans, and then when they got their SBA dollars from the federal government, then they were able to repay that money, and then we were able to use that money for the several years that we operated. And for a period of about 3 years, the committee that I chaired, that had representatives from every Jewish organization in the community, essentially ran the Jewish community. Rather than trying to deal with all the separate boards, we realized it was going to be very difficult. And as a result, I spent most of my time working with the task force to get that funding in place with the federal government for the broad community. Then I was spending almost all my time trying to deal with the Jewish community issues.
Mhm.
So by that time, our family had moved from the motel room into a one-room apartment and finally into a three-bedroom townhouse that was about as big as this kitchen on two floors. And but and in the meantime, I had a law practice. Our law practice was hit dramatically. I mean, if you can imagine all the business people that we represented. I mean, we had at that time an enormous garment manufacturing operation in the valley, some 60 manufacturing sites, all
Wow.
small, all Jewish owned. And the net effect was that um, after a year, we owned the property, we had gotten it cleaned up, but now it had to be finished off. So I said to Connie, my wife, hey, listen, I don't have the time. I just can't. So she, with 4 kids, managed to do everything that we had to do to turn the community, to turn the house around.
Wow.
Um, my brother, my brother's family, my sister's family,
Mhm.
and of course, as I said, my mother's home. They were all impacted by the flood. Everybody had their own distress. My brother served as the chairman of because he was the chairman of the board of the United Hebrew Institute trustees that owned the building. So he chaired the whole recovery of that property.
Right.
But as I said, fortunately, it was just a matter of dealing with the federal bureaucracy, but the money came from the federal government.
Okay. What was your flood protection system before the
Okay.
flood happened?
Our flood protection system accommodated the flood level of the 1936 flood. And that flood level was totally inadequate. So we then undertook a course, Federal Corps of Engineers undertook a course of temporarily raising the dikes.
Mm-hmm.
But the ultimate program was to do a very extensive um, restructure of all the dikes. But that was going to be an enormous project.
Mm-hmm.
It was going to be a $30 million project. And maybe we can take a walk just a couple of doors down and I'll show it to you. In any event, believe it or not, they did not finish the restructure of the dike system in the Wyoming Valley until about 3 years ago,
Wow.
from 1972. I mean, that's the bureaucracy, that was all of the other things. So we had a temporary situation. Fortunately, we did not have any flooding. But the dikes were raised about 13 to 14 feet higher than they were when we had the flood in 1972. So now let's take what happened last spring.
Mm-hmm. Storm Lee.
Storm Lee. Well, Storm Lee came, and the river started to rise. Connie wanted us to evacuate the house. I didn't want to evacuate the house.
So you didn't think it would flood over?
I didn't think it would flood over. In fact, interestingly, it didn't flood over. But it reached 14 and a half feet.
Wow.
Now, we were told that the dike, uh, the new dike would only cover to 13 feet. Fortunately, it covered 14 and a half feet.
Wow.
So the river crested right at the top of the dike.
Wow.
Now, unfortunately, upstream,
Hmm.
there the people who lived along the river didn't suffer the way we did in 1972, and they didn't want the dike. They had no dike at all.
They didn't have any flood protection up there.
Nope, no flood protection, because they said in 1972 they had no problem.
Uh,
Well, unfortunately, they were, as a result of the flood last spring, they were terribly devastated. And because they were small communities
hmm
and did not have the organizational volunteers that we had back in 1972, and because they weren't as organized as we were able to get to be, um, they're still waiting to get their loans resolved. Their interest rate is much higher. Their interest rate is 4%, no forgiveness. And it's been very, very difficult for them, and we feel badly for them. But the vast majority of the area, and the net effect of where we are, we were not impacted. Unfortunately though, what was a vibrant Jewish community began to shrink
upstream.
here.
Oh, here.
So we went from
Oh.
1972, 6,000 Jews, to now we're approximately 1,600. And with the people who have died, the people who have moved, the children who moved, I mean, the Jewish community, unfortunately, has just never been the same. It's never really recovered. But we still have a day school. Instead of 150 or 175 kids, we have 45 kids. The shul, instead of having the large family membership, we now have 150 families. Um, but we still continue to survive.
That's good. A flood at the level of Agnes was estimated to happen only every 345 years.
Yeah.
And yet it happened twice in 40 years. Do you think it could happen again?
Do I think it could happen? I guess it could happen. Anytime you live in next to a river, that, as I'll show you, right now you can't imagine how it could get to the height that it did. It could happen. I mean, the weather patterns have changed. Um, why they've changed, who knows? But we can see. I mean, look at New Orleans. New Orleans has not had the kind of a storm that devastated them before or since. I mean, the last incident, they were okay. Um, so could it happen again? Yep. Does that mean that there are a lot of people who don't want to live in the flatland? Yep. I mean, all of my children now live in the back mountain, um, up high, and but we still hang in here.
Do you think the government did its best at helping you to recover after the flood?
In '97, yeah,
Yeah.
they did remarkably well. I mean, but for that, this would be a deserted area because people just could never have. The banks couldn't have financed it. I mean, if you can imagine, all the banks
Yeah.
were destroyed, and there was a question as to whether the banks would ever open. again.
Wow.
I mean, it was quite a, it really was quite an experience.
Do you think they're doing the same or better job now for Stormley?
Well, there wasn't much that they could do, to be honest with you, and frankly, um, um, they never replaced. We had a mechanical piece of equipment that was on the bridge that was never replaced. So there really was no accurate measurement of the river last spring.
Uh-huh.
And we were going pretty much based upon what people thought. When they ultimately made the measurement, though, as I said, it turned out to be a foot and 3/4 higher than what the federal government told us was the maximum level, so we figured we were in major league trouble.
Right.
But what they have done for the community, they've made a magnificent park area for us. Fortunately, the engineering of the replacement dikes was perfect because it withstood all of the pressure of that river, even though it was really right to the top. You would have thought that the pressure of all that volume of water rushing, I mean, it wasn't just sitting there, it was just rushing past, would have collapsed. It did, and one side, on the opposite side from where we live, on the river, in an area that it's called 44, one of the dikes started to break up.
Mm-hmm.
It started to break up, and they thought that would give. Fortunately, they were able to get dirt and just pile it up and to essentially dam the area. Now, interestingly enough, they haven't done those repairs yet, but they say they should be done shortly.
That's good.
Shortly.
You never know when shortly is with the government.
Right.
Okay. Thank you so much. This was
My
amazing.
pleasure. My pleasure.